The morning sun painted golden streaks across the ancient stone walls of Eldermere Palace as Prince Alexander stood at his bedroom window, watching the crowds gather in the courtyard below. Today was the day he and Princess Isabella would be crowned King and Queen of Valdoria, but his heart felt heavy with the weight of recent tragedy. Just 8 months ago, his father, King Edmund, had passed away unexpectedly from a sudden illness, leaving the kingdom in mourning and Alexander unprepared for the crown that would soon rest upon his head. The 28-year-old prince had always imagined he would have more time to learn from his father, more years to prepare for the enormous responsibility of ruling a nation of 12 million people. Isabella found him there, still in his mourning clothes, staring out at the sea of people who had traveled from every corner of Valdoria to witness their coronation. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch immediately calming the storm of anxiety that had been brewing in his chest since dawn. "They're not here just for the ceremony," she said softly, her voice carrying the wisdom that had made her such a beloved figure among the people. "They're here because they believe in us, Alexander. They believe in what we represent together." Isabella had not been born into royalty. The daughter of a school teacher from the mountain province of North Vale, she had met Alexander during his university years when she was studying international relations. Their love story had captured the hearts of the Valdorian people, a prince who chose love over political arrangement, and a commoner who won the respect of nobles and citizens alike through her genuine compassion and intelligence. Their engagement 3 years ago had brought hope to a kingdom that had been struggling with economic challenges and social divisions. Isabella's background allowed her to connect with ordinary citizens in ways the royal family never could before, while Alexander's dedication to reform and modernization promised a new era for Valdoria. But the sudden death of King Edmund had thrust them into their roles much sooner than anyone expected. The past 8 months had been a whirlwind of learning, grieving, and trying to provide stability to a nation in transition. Alexander had thrown himself into understanding every aspect of governance, working 18-hour days with advisors and ministers, while Isabella had focused on connecting with charitable organizations and community leaders across the kingdom. The morning of their coronation had arrived gray and cloudy, with weather forecasters predicting possible rain throughout the day. Alexander couldn't help but see it as an ominous sign, though Isabella had laughed and reminded him that rain was considered good luck in many cultures. As they prepared for the ceremony, Isabella's lady-in-waiting brought news that made both their hearts sink. Lady Margaret, who had been like a grandmother to Alexander since his own grandmother's death, had fallen ill during the night and would not be able to attend the coronation. She had been one of King Edmund's closest advisors and had spent countless hours teaching Alexander about the history and traditions of the monarchy. "She wanted me to give you this," the lady-in-waiting said, handing Alexander a small, worn leather box. Inside was his father's personal signet ring, the one King Edmund had worn every day of his life but had never passed down during official ceremonies. Alexander's eyes filled with tears as he slipped the ring onto his finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Isabella squeezed his hand, understanding without words the significance of this final connection to his father. The cathedral bells began to ring across the capital city of Valdenhall, signaling that the coronation ceremony would begin in 2 hours. Thousands of people had already gathered along the processional route from the palace to the ancient Cathedral of St. Morwen, where Valdorian monarchs had been crowned for over 6 centuries. Alexander and Isabella were scheduled to make their entrance to the cathedral in the traditional golden carriage, a magnificent vehicle that had been crafted over 200 years ago and used only for the most significant royal occasions. The carriage had been recently restored to its original glory with intricate gold leaf designs that told the story of Valdoria's founding and its journey through centuries of triumph and challenge. As the royal couple prepared for the ceremony, their dressers helped them into the traditional coronation robes. Alexander wore deep burgundy velvet trimmed with ermine and gold embroidery that depicted the symbols of Valdoria's 4 provinces. Isabella's gown was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, created by local artisans using silk, produced in Valdoria's southern regions, and embroidered with threads of silver and gold. But it wasn't the grandeur of their clothing or the magnificence of the ceremony that weighed on their minds. Both Alexander and Isabella were thinking about the promises they would make to their people, the vows to serve and protect that would define the rest of their lives. The couple had spent weeks writing their own personal additions to the traditional coronation vows. They wanted to speak directly to the challenges facing modern Valdoria, the need for environmental protection, economic opportunity for young people, and healing the divisions that had grown between urban and rural communities. Isabella had insisted on including a pledge to make education more accessible throughout the kingdom, drawing on her own experience as the daughter of an educator. Alexander had added promises about transparency in government and creating new opportunities for citizen participation in the democratic processes that worked alongside the constitutional monarchy. As noon approached, the sounds from outside grew louder. Military bands were practicing their ceremonial music, horses were being prepared for the processional guard, and the crowds were singing traditional Valdorian songs that had been passed down through generations. Alexander's private secretary knocked on the door with the final schedule. "Your Highnesses, the carriage will be ready in 30 minutes. The processional route is completely lined with well-wishers, and security reports that everything is proceeding smoothly." Isabella took one last look in the mirror. Adjusting the simple silver necklace she always wore, a gift from her parents that she had worn on every important day of her life. Alexander straightened his ceremonial sash and took a deep breath. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, taking Isabella's hand in his. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," she replied, though her voice carried a slight tremor that revealed her own nervousness. "We're going to do this together, just like we've done everything else." As they walked toward the palace entrance where their carriage waited, Alexander felt his father's ring on his finger and thought about Lady Margaret's words from the night before the king's funeral. "A crown is not a symbol of power, Alexander. It's a symbol of service. Never forget that the weight you feel is not the weight of gold, but the weight of every life you're responsible for." The massive palace doors opened, and Alexander and Isabella stepped into the light, ready to begin their journey to the cathedral and toward the destiny that awaited them as the new monarchs of Valdoria. The golden carriage rolled slowly through the cobblestone streets of Valdenhall, its wheels creating a rhythmic melody against the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal processions. Alexander and Isabella sat side by side, waving to the crowds that lined every inch of the route from the palace to the cathedral. What neither of them had expected was the reaction of the people. As their carriage approached each section of the crowd, a hush would fall over the thousands of gathered citizens, followed by something that seemed almost magical, voices joining together in spontaneous song. It began with the children from the Palace District Orphanage, who had been given special places at the front of the barriers. Their young voices rose in a traditional Valdorian blessing song, clear and pure in the morning air. The melody was simple, but the words spoke of hope and new beginnings. As the carriage moved forward, adults began joining the children's song. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of voices, united in a harmony that seemed to resonate from the very stones of the ancient city. Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes as she recognized faces in the crowd, people she had met during her visits to schools and hospitals, elderly citizens she had spoken with at community centers. Alexander noticed his voice catching in his throat as he saw a group of veterans from Valdoria's peacekeeping forces, many in wheelchairs or using walking aids, saluting as the carriage passed. These were men and women who had served under his father's reign, who had sacrificed for the kingdom, and were now showing their trust in his leadership. but it was what happened next that would be remembered for generations to come. As the carriage turned onto Cathedral Avenue, the main thoroughfare leading to St. Morwen's Cathedral, the skies that had been threatening rain all morning suddenly cleared. Brilliant sunlight broke through the clouds, casting everything in a golden glow that seemed almost divine. At that exact moment, an elderly woman in the front row of spectators called out in a voice that somehow carried over the singing crowd, "Bless you, my children. Bless you for choosing love." Isabella recognized the voice immediately. It was Mrs. Elena Thorne, a 93-year-old woman from Isabella's home province who had been her first-grade teacher. Isabella had not known that Mrs. Thorne had made the difficult journey to the capital for the coronation. The carriage stopped, though this was not part of the planned ceremony. Alexander looked at Isabella, understanding immediately what she needed to do. Together they stood in the carriage, and Isabella called out, "Mrs. Thorne, you came!" The elderly teacher's face lit up with joy, and she raised a trembling hand in response. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world, my dear Isabella. Your parents would be so proud." Isabella's parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and their absence today had been weighing heavily on her heart. But seeing Mrs. Thorne, surrounded by people from her home community who had traveled hundreds of miles to be there, Isabella felt their presence in a way that overwhelmed her with gratitude. Unable to contain her emotions any longer, Isabella stepped down from the carriage, despite the protests of her security detail. She walked to Mrs. Thorne and embraced her teacher, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Alexander joined her, and Mrs. Thorne took both their hands. "You two represent something special," she said, her voice now picked up by the media microphones. "You represent the truth that love and kindness can overcome any challenge. That's what this kingdom needs. Not perfect rulers, but authentic leaders who remember where they came from." As Isabella and Alexander returned to their carriage, something beautiful began to happen throughout the crowd. People were no longer just watching a royal procession, they were participating in a moment of genuine human connection. Strangers were hugging, families were lifting children onto their shoulders to get better views, and the singing had evolved into a joyful celebration that felt more like a community festival than a formal ceremony. The carriage continued toward the cathedral, but the pace was now slower, more deliberate. Alexander and Isabella had abandoned the formal royal wave in favor of reaching out to touch hands, accept flowers, and acknowledge individuals in the crowd. Security guards initially tried to maintain protocol, but even they seemed moved by the unprecedented warmth of the moment. When they reached the cathedral steps, Archbishop Morrison was waiting with tears in his own eyes. The 70-year-old religious leader had presided over King Edmund's funeral and had known Alexander since he was a child. He later said that in all his years of service, he had never witnessed such a powerful demonstration of the bond between royal family and citizens. The cathedral itself had been decorated with flowers from every province of Valdoria. The ancient stone columns were wrapped with garlands of mountain laurel from North Vale, coastal roses from the eastern provinces, and golden wheat from the central farming regions. The air inside was filled with the mixed fragrances of Valdoria's diverse landscapes. As Alexander and Isabella walked down the cathedral aisle, the congregation rose in unison. Unlike typical royal ceremonies where guests were selected primarily for their political importance, Isabella had insisted that half the seats be reserved for ordinary citizens chosen by lottery. Teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, and students sat alongside ambassadors and nobility. The ceremony itself blended ancient traditions with modern elements that reflected Alexander and Isabella's vision for Valdoria. The traditional Latin prayers were followed by readings in the contemporary Valdorian language. Children's choirs from different provinces performed alongside the cathedral's formal musicians. When the moment came for the actual crowning, Archbishop Morrison asked Alexander and Isabella to kneel before the altar. The crown of Valdoria, encrusted with sapphires and diamonds that caught the light streaming through the cathedral's stained glass windows, was lifted above Alexander's head. But before placing the crown, Archbishop Morrison spoke words that had never been part of a Valdorian coronation before. Alexander Edmund Charles, do you promise to serve not as a ruler over your people, but as their servant and guardian? I do, Alexander replied, his voice strong and clear. Isabella Marie, do you promise to use your position not for personal glory, but to amplify the voices of those who have none? I do, Isabella answered, her voice equally firm. As the crowns were placed upon their heads, the cathedral bells began to ring, joined by every church bell in Valdenhall. The sound rolled across the city and out into the countryside, where communities had gathered around radios and televisions to witness their new monarchs take their vows. But it was the moment when Alexander and Isabella stood and turned to face their people that would become the image remembered forever. Hand in hand, crowned but somehow still appearing humble and approachable, they looked out at the congregation and smiled with such genuine warmth that several guests later reported feeling as if they had been personally welcomed into the royal family. The formal ceremony concluded with the traditional presentation to the people, but again, Alexander and Isabella chose to modify the ancient ritual. Instead of appearing briefly on the cathedral balcony, they spent nearly an hour greeting individuals in the crowd, accepting congratulations and listening to personal messages from citizens. As the afternoon sun began to set over Valdenhall, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the newly crowned King Alexander and Queen Isabella finally returned to their carriage for the journey back to the palace. The crowd that had gathered in the morning had grown throughout the day, and the singing had never stopped. The evening following the coronation, King Alexander and Queen Isabella stood once again at the palace windows, but this time the view was entirely different. The courtyard below was filled not with the morning's nervous energy, but with a gentle celebration that seemed to have no end. Families had spread blankets on the grass, children played traditional games, and musicians performed folk songs that had been passed down through generations. The spontaneous festival in the palace grounds had begun when citizens who had attended the ceremony simply did not want the day to end. Rather than dispersing after the procession, they had gathered in the palace park, sharing food, telling stories, and creating an atmosphere of joy that palace staff had never witnessed before. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Isabella asked, watching an elderly couple dancing to accordion music while their grandchildren clapped along. Alexander shook his head, still processing the extraordinary day. "My father always said that the best gauge of a successful reign would be whether people felt more hopeful at the end than they did at the beginning. I think we might be off to a good start." Inside the palace, the formal reception was taking place. But it too had taken on an unexpectedly warm character. Instead of the usual stiff diplomatic conversations, guests were engaged in animated discussions about the day's events and what they meant for Valdoria's future. Mrs. Elena Thorne, who had been invited to the palace reception after her emotional encounter with Isabella, was holding court in the main salon, surrounded by ambassadors and government ministers who were fascinated by her stories about Isabella's childhood. The 93-year-old teacher seemed to be enjoying every moment of being treated as the guest of honor. "She was always special," Mrs. Thorne was saying to a group that included the Prime Minister and the ambassador from neighboring Astoria. Even as a 6-year-old, Isabella had this way of making everyone feel included. She would notice the shy children and make sure they had someone to play with at recess. The impact of the day's events was already being felt beyond the palace walls. Social media was filled with videos of the singing crowds, photographs of Alexander and Isabella's interactions with citizens, and messages from people around the world who had been moved by the authentic emotion of the ceremony. News outlets from across Europe were calling it the most emotionally powerful royal ceremony in modern history. But more importantly for Alexander and Isabella, the messages pouring in from ordinary Valdorians showed that their coronation had achieved something they had hoped for, but hardly dared expect. It had brought the country together. Regional differences that had been growing more pronounced in recent years seemed to fade as people from all four provinces shared their experiences of the day. The mountain communities of North Vale were celebrating alongside coastal fishing villages. Urban professionals in Valdenhall were connecting with rural farmers, and young people were talking with elderly citizens about their hopes for the kingdom's future. 3 days after the coronation, Alexander and Isabella received a letter that moved them deeply. It came from a group of teenagers in the Eastern Province who had watched the ceremony on television and had been inspired to start a community service project in their town. "Your Majesties," the letter read, "watching you stop your carriage to hug Mrs. Y. Thorne made us realize that being a leader means paying attention to real people, not just going through the motions. We want to follow your example in our own community. We've organized a group to visit elderly residents who don't have family nearby, and we're planning to help with literacy programs for immigrant families. Thank you for showing us what authentic leadership looks like." The letter was signed by 47 young people and included hand-drawn pictures and personal messages. Isabella kept it on her desk and read it whenever she needed reminding of why their work mattered. Within 2 weeks of the coronation, similar community initiatives had sprung up across Valdoria. The spontaneous singing that had characterized the coronation day had evolved into organized community choirs. The connections made between strangers during the celebration had led to new friendships and collaborative projects. Most significantly, the waiting lists for civic volunteer organizations had grown by over 300%. Citizens who had felt disconnected from their government were suddenly eager to participate in community improvement projects, local politics, and charitable work. Alexander and Isabella made a decision that would define their reign from the very beginning. Rather than retreating into the traditional isolation of monarchy, they chose to build on the connection they had established during their coronation entrance. They instituted monthly walkabouts in different communities, unscheduled visits where they would simply walk through neighborhoods, visit local businesses, and talk with whoever wanted to share their thoughts or concerns. These informal meetings became known as kitchen table conversations because Isabella had suggested that the best discussions happened around family dinner tables. The first of these visits took place in the industrial city of Millbrook, where unemployment had been rising due to factory closures. Instead of a formal tour with prepared presentations, Alexander and Isabella spent the day in coffee shops, community centers, and family homes, listening to people's stories and learning about challenges that government statistics could never capture. During one of these conversations, they met Maria Santos, a single mother who was working 3 part-time jobs to support her 2 children while studying nursing at night school. Her story inspired Alexander and Isabella to push for new legislation, supporting working parents and expanding access to higher education. Before the coronation, Maria later told a local newspaper, "I thought the royal family lived in a completely different world from the rest of us. But when Queen Isabella sat at my kitchen table and helped my daughter with her homework while King Alexander and I talked about childcare challenges, I realized they really do understand what normal families go through." As the first months of their reign unfolded, Alexander and Isabella discovered that their authentic approach to monarchy was having effects they had never anticipated. International relations improved as other world leaders responded positively to Valdoria's more open and collaborative style of diplomacy. Economic indicators began showing improvement as the renewed sense of national unity and purpose translated into increased tourism, international investment, and domestic consumer confidence. The Valdorian model of accessible monarchy began attracting attention from political scientists and leadership experts around the world. But for Alexander and Isabella, the most meaningful measure of their success continued to be the letters, drawings, and small gifts that arrived at the palace from ordinary citizens. Children sent them artwork depicting the Coronation Day. Elderly people shared family recipes and stories. Young adults wrote about their dreams and aspirations for the kingdom. One evening, exactly 6 months after their coronation, Alexander and Isabella were reviewing these messages when they came across a package from Mrs. Eleanor Thorne. Inside was a carefully preserved photograph of Isabella as a 7-year-old student, standing in front of her class with a handmade crown of paper and flowers. The accompanying note read, "My dear Isabella, I found this picture while cleaning out old-school files. Even then, you wore your crown with grace and made everyone around you feel special. Some people are born to serve others, and you and Alexander are proving that every single day. Your parents would be so proud. The little girl in this picture grew up to be exactly the kind of queen our kingdom needed." Isabella held the photograph with tears in her eyes, remembering that long-ago school play where she had been chosen to play the role of a kind queen who brought peace to her land. At 7 years old, she had never imagined that the pretend crown would someday become real, or that the lessons about kindness and service that she learned in Mrs. Thorne's classroom would guide her in ruling an actual kingdom. As the first year of their reign drew to a close, Alexander and Isabella could see that their coronation entrance had been more than just a moment of emotional connection. It had been the beginning of a new relationship between the monarchy and the people of Valdoria, one based on mutual respect, open communication, and shared commitment to the common good. The golden carriage that had carried them to the cathedral on Coronation Day was put on permanent display in the Palace Museum, along with videos and photographs from that extraordinary day. But the real legacy of their grand entrance was not found in any artifact or recording. It lived in the renewed spirit of unity that characterized Valdoria, in the community projects that continued to flourish, in the young people who had been inspired to serve others, and in the simple truth that authentic leadership, rooted in love and humility, had the power to transform not just a ceremony, but an entire kingdom. The crowds had been moved to tears on Coronation Day, not because of royal grandeur or ancient tradition, but because they had witnessed something increasingly rare in the modern world, leaders who genuinely cared about the people they served. And in the years that followed, that emotional connection would prove to be the foundation for a reign that brought prosperity, peace, and hope to all the citizens of Valdoria.